Daniel Reichers, Dr. Daniel Reichers, I should say. But I guess the rest of you I haven't met before. As Christina mentioned, I'm a grant development coordinator in the College of Sciences, and I've been at UTSA since 2017. And I have about close to 20 years grant writing experience. Most of it is in grant writing. I mean, some of it is in evaluation because obviously I've been responsible for writing evaluation sections. But I think my expertise is more with grant development and grant writing, although I do have a lot of familiarity with program evaluation. So let me share my screen with everybody. A second. Well, it's not pulling in there. Hold on, let me try that again. There it is. Okay. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
I can see your screen.
Okay, great. Okay, so, before we get started, I just wanted to give everyone an overview of what I'm going to be covering in this session. So I'm going to talk about why evaluation is important, what's involved in the process. We're going to also talk about internal versus external evaluation, as well as the types of evaluation. And I'd also like to cover some examples from different funding agencies, just to give you a sense of what criteria that they're looking for in the evaluation section. And last but not least, I'm going to try to cover logic models. We're going to go over why they're important, and also talk about show you some examples. So hopefully they will be helpful. And then we'll have hopefully some time at the end for Q&A. Okay, so why do we need program evaluation? I found this cartoon online and I thought it was very fitting. As you can see, it's from Tiger Comics. I'm not really familiar with the characters, but the kid in there says, "I taught Stripe how to whistle." And his buddy says, "I don't hear him whistling." Well, his friend then responds and says, "I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it." So I thought that was rather cute. Okay, so an evaluation plan, according to the CDC, provides written details on how you will monitor and evaluate your project, and how you intend to use those results to improve your project and make informed decisions. So it answers the what, the how, and why it matters for your project. So that's why evaluation is really important, because it helps you measure the impact of the project in achieving your goals and objectives. It assesses the progress made at various stages. It helps you address any barriers that you encounter. It also helps you understand what works and why. And on the contrary, it'll help you understand what doesn't work and why doesn't work, or why doesn't it work. And so this is really important because it could also provide new insights on any unanticipated results. And this happens quite a bit in grants. And last, but definitely not least, it sometimes and usually it is required by the funder or funding agency. So here's another meme I found online, where the researcher says, "I can't tell you how valuable your program is, but the evaluator says, I can." So I came across this book a while back, and I think this is a really good book for people that are just starting the grant writing process. So if that's you, I would definitely recommend it. It's by O'Neill, McElrath, and Carlson. Now this one's the 4th edition. They have a 5th edition now available. I have not, I don't know how much it costs and I haven't read that one. But if you're a novice grant writer, I definitely would recommend getting this book, either this version or the latest. So I really like how they laid this out, because they tell you evaluation can help, answer the following. Did you do what you set out to do? Were your specified methods used and were your objectives met? Was an impact made on the identified need or problem? Did you obtain feedback from the target population served, stakeholders, and other members of the community? It's also important because it helps maintain control over the project, so it allows you to make corrective action if needed, and it allows you to make changes needed to ensure the project's success. So who should evaluate your project? Well, this decision, it depends on so many different factors. So you can choose an internal evaluator. So it could be somebody in your department. It could be you if it's a small grant, or it could be part of a different college or department within UTSA. Obviously, an external evaluator would be somebody outside of UTSA that you would contract for evaluation services. And I've seen this quite a bit. And I know when I was at the UT Health Science Center, we did this quite a bit. Used a possible combination of both, where you pretty much get your internal staff to evaluate it, but you will hire an external consultant for specific things. Like, for example, if you're running advanced statistics and nobody there knows how to run them, then that's when you would hire an external evaluator just for that portion. So it'd be less expensive than hiring the external evaluator. Okay, so I kind of listed the pros and cons of hiring an internal evaluator. So I guess one of the pros is you use existing staff and resources, so therefore you save money by doing that. Another advantage is that it promotes and builds staff participation and expertise. And also, this one's an important factor. Usually if you use internal staff or PIs, they have an understanding of the project and the context as well as the environment. I guess the disadvantages of using an internal evaluator would be time constraints, because often evaluating a project is very time consuming. Also, staff may not have the required knowledge that you need for certain aspects of the evaluation, such as running advanced statistics. Also, the funder or the funding agency may perceive the evaluation results as less objective. Okay, now in terms of hiring an external evaluator, they're often perceived as more objective by the funder or funding agency, and sometimes they're required. Sometimes the funding agency will state that they highly recommend an external evaluator, in which case you should hire an external evaluator. Often, as mentioned before, they're more knowledgeable about technical aspects of the evaluation. So something like repeated ANOVA, regression analysis, structural equation modeling. They know all these advanced multivariate statistics. Also, they may offer a new perspective. So that would be another reason why to use an external evaluator. In terms of the disadvantages, one of the major ones could be the cost involved. Usually an evaluator will cost you about 5 to 10% of your grant. However, sometimes I've seen evaluators charge up to 20%, and it's often allowable by the funding agency. They usually explicitly state how much of your budget you can allocate towards the evaluator. So it's really important to keep all of that in mind. Also, another disadvantage is that they may not have an understanding or knowledge or context of the program. For example, they may not be familiar with the target population. They may also have difficulty in gaining access to certain types of information. So there's certain types of information that's confidential that would need to be de-identified, and sometimes that could be hard to get to the evaluators. Okay, so where to find an evaluator? I strongly recommend asking a colleague or a mentor for recommendations. Usually they know people and they know that evaluator's reputation, and they can give you some insights as to what that evaluator's area of expertise is in. For example, without mentioning any names, I know UTSA uses an evaluator, external evaluator for a lot of STEM projects. However, for NIH, he may not be a good fit because that's more of a public health type grant. So, you know, just make sure that the evaluator's experience kind of matches up with the kinds of things that you're planning on doing in your grant project. And so another good resource would be the American Evaluation Association. So if you click on here, I'm not going to do that right now, but this link here will provide you a list of evaluators, and I think you can find them by city. So that's another good resource. And also the National Organization of Research Development Professionals, NORDP, they have a list as well. So I provided the link there for you. Okay, does anybody have any questions? I know I've already moved on to the next slide, but any questions so far?
Nothing yet in the chat.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide, which, okay, so now I want to go over some types of evaluation. So there are two types of evaluation usually requested by funding agencies. So one is formative evaluation, and you'll often see this also referred to as process or progress evaluation. And then there's summative evaluation. So some agencies refer to it as outcome or impact evaluation, but they all pretty much mean the same thing. Okay, so what does formative evaluation do? It gathers information to improve or strengthen the development, implementation, and progress of a project. So it begins to take place at the beginning of the grant, and it occurs while the project is ongoing. So the emphasis is on whether or not your project is being carried out as planned. And that's what fidelity is, or what's meant by fidelity, and whether or not your project needs to be improved, modified, and how you're going to manage your project activities as needed. Okay, so now summative evaluation, it's what it sounds like, right? It gathers information to determine the extent to which you accomplished your goals, objectives, and or anticipated outcomes of the project. So it occurs after the project has been in place and the time frame for achieving the goals and or objectives have already occurred. So the emphasis here is on the impact of the project in achieving its intended outcomes. But what you need to remember here too, though, so summative evaluation doesn't necessarily mean it's only going to take place at the end of the grant. Just to give you an example, if you have annual goals and objectives in, let's say, a 3-year grant, then you would conduct summative evaluation at the end of each year of the grant, if that makes sense. Any questions on that? Okay, so quantitative data methods are used in both formative and summative evaluations. So just to give you a few examples, you can use surveys or questionnaires. What's really important, though, is to consider the validity and reliability of surveys. I would strongly recommend finding a survey that's already been out there. If it's going to measure what you want it to measure in your grant, I highly would recommend finding one with high reliability and validity. Another example of quantitative data methods are pre and post tests. So for example, if you have an intervention and you want to measure what, like I'd say it's a evidence-based curriculum, and you want to measure how well it did when you introduced it to your students. So you would have them take a pre and then post test. So it measures changes in either knowledge, attitudes, and or beliefs. And then one final example is just participant demographics. That would be one as a quantitative data method. Okay, so in terms of qualitative data methods, they provide an understanding of the project's context to explain complex issues and interactions. So examples of qualitative research are observations, focus groups, interviews, and case studies. Now, not all funding agencies, maybe especially not foundations, but a lot of federal agencies like to see both qualitative and quantitative methods in your grant applications. That's what I mostly see, although this has happened to me quite a bit. I'm reviewing somebody's grant application, and they talk about in their methods that they're going to use both or use a mixed methods approach, and then they describe all the qualitative data measures they're going to collect, but then they don't discuss the quantitative, or vice versa. So it's really important to provide details to the funding agency in terms of what you're planning on doing. Okay, so here's a sample of some formative process evaluation measures. These measures were used in a SAMHSA grant that served adults diagnosed with a substance abuse disorder. They were re-entering the community after being involved in the criminal justice system. So as you can see, the service dosage form, this is obviously quantitative, right? Because it's capturing the type of data, the number, duration of services, and the linkages provided to clients. And then this table was submitted with the grant application. It was in the narrative, and it was in the evaluation section. So in here, what we did was just document what the purpose of that form was and who was going to collect it and when was it going to be collected. And so here's fidelity. We collected the fidelity on a evidence-based curriculum called Seeking Safety. And so they had a Seeking Safety fidelity adherence scale. But notice this scale is quantitative and qualitative. So again, a lot of your process measures are going to include both qualitative and quantitative methods. But it's really hard to find qualitative measures used in summative evaluation. That's not very common. But anyway, so this is just an example I wanted to show everybody of the type of measures that were collected in this grant. And so here are the summative evaluation measures. So obviously these are both quantitative. GIPRA indicators, I don't know if anybody's familiar with those, but these are actually required. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration requires them, and so does the U.S. Department of Education. Now, obviously, the GIPRA measures are different for the U.S. Department of Ed than these, but as you can see, these are the GIPRA indicators that were collected on this grant. So they were collected at baseline, 6-month and 12-month follow-up. And then this was a local measure we used, which were service gaps for these clients. So basically collecting services they needed and were not getting at baseline, 6-month and 12-month follow-up. Okay, next, I want to show you some examples of grant evaluation section criteria. So every funding agency has different criteria required for specific programs. This includes both between and within agencies. So for example, NIH has so many different centers and institutions. So each one of those has their own set of requirements. And even more so, the solicitation, that gets into really specific information that's needed. So often you will see things in a solicitation for example, for an NSF grant, that they change from year to year, or it's different. Even though it may be the same solicitation that came out, they make changes to it. So it's really important to pay attention to the guidelines and follow them. And also you cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach. Your evaluation needs to be specifically geared towards your proposed project. And of course, your proposed project needs to be aligned with the funder's goals and how they're wanting to fund or spend their money. Oops, I think I went backwards. Okay, so here's an example of evaluation criteria for the U.S. Department of Education. So U.S. Department of Education really stresses the importance of SMART goals, objectives, and anticipated outcomes. And by SMART goals, what I'm referring to, and I'm sure many of you already know about these because you hear them all the time. They're specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So they really put an emphasis on the qualifications and relevant experience and training of the evaluator as well as other consultants. And the evaluation design should, at a minimum, meet the What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards with reservations, or the What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards without reservations. So just to kind of explain what that is a little bit, with reservations, you're looking at a quasi-experimental design or random control design with high levels of attrition, whereas without, that would be a randomized control trial with low levels of sample attrition. So you really want to aim for without, but they'll fund with reservations. But So obviously, if you're working on a large US Department of Ed grant, you probably want to contract an evaluator for that program. Okay, so in terms of NSF, what they really focus on is formative and summative evaluation goals and objectives aims. So they want your evaluation plan to include these, and they want you to answer your evaluation questions with these. So in terms of the evaluation section components, in NSF grants, you have the evaluation design, evaluation questions, data collection methods, analyses, reporting, dissemination, and sometimes, and I've seen this quite a bit, they often ask you for sustainability strategies. So I found this from their PPAG, which is their big, thick manual or that has all of their guidance. So in terms of evaluation, it should be based on appropriate metrics, keeping in mind the likely correlation between the effect of broader impacts and the resources provided to implement projects. And of course, some of your NSF grants often require logic models. Not all the time. I've seen it maybe out of the grants I've worked on, maybe like 30% will request the logic model. Okay, so here's another example from NIH. This is NIH NIAID. So the focus of NIH, or specifically NIAID, is on addressing a highly significant problem or innovation. So the way they want your grant laid out, they want you to include a research plan, and your research plan includes specific aims with at least one or more hypotheses. So what's important to remember is that your specific aim should cover broad, long-term goals. So the specific hypothesis to be tested, also, you have to summarize your expected outcomes and then describe the impact on the research field. So in terms of your research strategy, because that's the next section of your plan, you have to address significance, innovation, and approach. And so your approach, again, needs to be organized around specific aims. So really, your evaluation should focus on the appropriateness of planned analyses and statistical approach to the proposed study design and whatever methods you plan on using. Okay, so next, I want to go over the steps involved in developing an evaluation plan. So CDC came up with 6 steps in their evaluation framework. So the first one is engage your stakeholders. So this includes your target population, your evaluator, your intended users, and even your funding agency, right? Because they have a stake in the results of your program. So number 2 is describe the program. Again, this is where the logic model comes into play, and I'll be going over logic models in a few minutes. Number 3 is focus the evaluation design. So in here, you want to describe your methodology, what you're proposing to do. Number 4, gather credible evidence. This involves your measures and indicators. Number 5 is to justify conclusions. So this is where you would interpret your findings, make recommendations and whatnot. And number 6 is ensure use and share lessons learned. So you really want to share what worked, what didn't work, and maybe even in hindsight, what could have been done better to make it work? What do you think could have been done better to improve outcomes? So here's just
a second, Monica. We have a question. This is from Feng Zhu. What are the evaluation criteria always clearly stated in the funding synopsis or other description? Thanks. Or are the evaluation criteria always clearly stated in the funding synopsis or other description? Thanks.
Oh, it depends on the funding agency. And I'm guessing she might be referring to NIH. Is that correct?
Actually, I'm more on the hard sciences, so it's not bio-related, maybe NSF.
Okay, yeah, NSF, it depends on the solicitation. That's why it's really important to pay attention, because I've had some solicitations in NSF require extra information in the evaluation section. I've worked on some where they're requiring a logic model in the solicitation, others where it's not even mentioned. So it's really important to pay attention to the specific solicitation or RFA to make sure that you're and I'm not just referring to the evaluation section, not just the whole narrative, basically. It's really, really important. And that's one of the main things I see, with, and it's not necessarily, but with the more novice grant writers, is they miss something. They miss an important bullet that was in the solicitation and didn't address it. So that's really key. Sometimes they will refer you to the guidelines too, so you may need to do that as well. They don't always give you all of the information in the solicitation or RFA. Sometimes they refer you to the program guidelines. So that's my advice to you. Just make sure you read and reread the RFA or solicitation.
Thank you. If I can ask a follow-up question.
Sure.
So if the evaluation measures are not mentioned, do we still need to include that section in our proposal writing, or we can say, well, we probably can ignore that?
Again, so this usually, I even see foundations now wanting you to evaluate even small grants in some shape, form, or fashion. There's usually something attached to it. So I definitely would, if you don't see anything like that, and whenever in doubt, contact the project officer. And of course, you're in the college. Of course, you're in the College of Sciences, so you could always contact me too.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Okay. Awesome. We have one more question. This is from Rebecca Bria. I'm in anthropology and have never heard of this requirement on a grant. Is it possible that external evaluators aren't typical for funding in certain disciplines? I joined late, so sorry if you covered this. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Not all grants require an evaluation. I say the majority do, but not all. Especially foundation grants, they're a little different. In foundation grants, you might be, if they do request for an evaluation, you might be the person responsible. So it varies. It varies from funding agents. I mean, most of the large funding agencies do, but so I'm talking about U.S. Department of Ed, NSF, NIH. Foundations are different and unique. I've seen foundations that request evaluations and even request rigorous evaluations. And I've seen others that they do maybe want to see outcomes, but they usually just expect the PI to provide those. So again, it depends. Those are both good questions, though.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions yet.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so so basically I just went over CDC's framework for the evaluation process in 6 steps. And in terms of the standards in the center, those are the standards for effective evaluation. So you got utility, feasibility, propriety, and accuracy. Okay, so I wanted to also show you what NSF lists as their 6 phases of the evaluation process. So this was taken from the 2010 user-friendly handbook of project evaluations. So their first step in the process is developing a conceptual model. So again, here's the logic model. Number 2 is to develop evaluation questions and define measurable outcomes. Number 3 is evaluate design. 4, data collection. 5, data analysis. And then number 6, dissemination of results to interested audiences. So as you can see, it's very similar to what the CDC evaluation process steps are. And this one I found online. Brown University had on their website their 5-step evaluation process. And again, it's very similar to what you saw from NSF and the CDC. Okay, so because they all talk about either conceptualizing or describing the grant project, we're going to go over logic models, or I'm going to go over them briefly. So a logic model is a conceptual model that shows the relationship between your project's inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. Logic models are important because they're often required by funding agencies, as I mentioned earlier, and they help organize and plan your project with outputs and anticipated outcomes. Something else that logic models can help with, not just in conceptualizing your project, but they could also help in the development of performance measures. So here are the logic model components. You have your inputs. These are the resources needed for program implementation. Activities, which are the interventions you plan on implementing to achieve your outcomes. Your outputs are direct results of activities. So kind of don't get those confused with outcomes, because outcomes are changes that your project or initiative intends to achieve if implemented as planned. Okay, so here is a logic model outline example that I really liked, because I thought it was very user-friendly, simple, and I like the way it explains the how and why in every step of the process. So it's simple, yet it's very descriptive. So you got your resources and your inputs. So these are programmatic investments available to support the program. So examples of this would be faculty, staff, technology, things of that nature. So for activities, these are the things you do, activities that you plan to conduct in your program. So they're sometimes also referred to as processes, methods, or strategies. Outputs, again, are the measurable projected results of your program. and they lead to your desired outcomes. And I like how they show how all of this impacts the target population, right? Because they're the user of the products or services. So that they're the target audience that your program is designed to reach. So now you have your outcomes. So they break it down here. You don't necessarily have to break it down into short-term, intermediate, and long-term, but this is how I've mostly seen it broken down. It depends, I guess, too, on the length of your project and what you plan to achieve during that time frame. But in terms of these, what you're looking at in terms of short term are changes in learning, knowledge, skills, or understanding. Intermediate, changes in behavior, practice, or decisions. And here's another example of a long term, changes in condition. So I really like this example. Any questions on that? Okay, and here's another one. This is from the Alcohol Literacy Challenge. So ALC is an evidence-based intervention that's used for youth, and it's been proven to reduce underage and binge drinking. So I know it's one of the models that SAMHSA has adopted. So again, I really like this logic model because it's simple and it explains everything. And I like the way it's laid out. So in terms of the inputs, you have local, regional, and national resources, usage data, prevention strategies. You have agency resources, personnel, experience, administration, and then you have your partners. So these are the places that are going to adopt this evidence-based curriculum. So you got schools, churches, youth, or youth programs. So in terms of the activities, those are the alcohol literacy challenge lessons. So this is the evidence-based curricula that has proven, according to SAMHSA, it's proven a reduction in underage and binge drinking for youth. So the outputs then would be your alcohol expectancies are challenged, real effects of drinking promoted, and then this in turn leads to your short-term outcomes of your target population or youth, which means their beliefs about drinking change and their drinking behaviors change. And then in terms of long-term outcomes, you know, what the goal of the evidence-based curriculum is it's to reduce alcohol consumption and reduce episodes of binge drinking. And so the impact would be reduced underage drinking harms. Okay, are there any questions about logic models? I wish we had more time and maybe could do an activity, but I didn't really, given the time I had and everything else going on, I probably could have planned this better, but maybe that's something I can do in the future. It's just, I think it takes a whole session just to go over logic models. So this is just a very brief overview. So hopefully I or we at UTSA can provide something like this in the future. Okay, so some final tips when writing your evaluation section, and I probably sound like a broken record by now, but this is really important. follow the funding agency requirements. This is number one. You can't write NSF grant and write the evaluation section and assume you can use it to apply for another grant, even within the agency. So just make sure it addresses the guidance. Decide what type of methods you will use. Are you going to use qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods? Make sure your evaluation section connects with your proposal's objectives and methods. This is really important. And of course, you want your objectives and methods to also be in line with what the funder is trying to do. What's their goal for this solicitation? You want to keep it realistic as well. You don't want to overpromise what you can't deliver. You don't want to say, oh, I'm going to have a 100% retention rate, for example, of your population when that's not realistic. So keep it realistic. Don't forget to include, I see this so often, and that's why I included this here. Do not forget to include your evaluation activities in your project timeline. Not every grant is going to ask for a project timeline, but I say the majority do. And sometimes it's in the evaluation section, but more often I see it in the project management section. But yet I noticed that faculty or PIs do not include their evaluation activities within the timeline. That's so important. They need to know what you're going to collect, when you're going to collect it, when you're going to analyze it, and when you're going to present the results. So that's just another thought I had. If you're working on a large grant or a grant, doesn't have to be necessarily very large, but if you're working with partners, you have a lot of stakeholders. I would strongly advise considering an advisory committee or an advisory board to serve. So basically what they normally do, it's like they're part of the evaluation. So what you do is get stakeholders involved. So you get representation from, like, I guess UTSA. If you're the PI at UTSA, you would serve on the advisory board, or somebody you're working with would serve on the advisory board. And you know, if you're partnering with another institution, they would serve. Depending on who you're serving, like if you're, let's just say you're submitting a STEM grant and you're serving students, you may want to have representation from one or two students on the advisory board, so to give you advice or their thoughts. So you have different perspectives. And basically they're looking at, or usually advisory boards meet, maybe I've seen them meet biannually or quarterly. I usually see them meet quarterly, but it just depends. But they go over the progress of the grant and provide input. And I think that's really important to do something like that, so that you can augment what's not working and make adjustments as needed. And then, of course, last but not least, you always have to keep your budget in mind. I know the indirect rate at UTSA is about, I think it's already over 50%. So always keep that in mind when you consider hiring an external evaluator. I think even an internal evaluator, somebody that's not in your department, I don't know what that would cost either, but you know, those are the kinds of things to keep in mind. And with that, these are my references. Does anybody have any questions?
Nothing in the chat box yet.
I know some of this is a little boring, but I'm hoping it was somewhat helpful. And again, I don't know where all of you are at within the process of writing grants and working on evaluations. But I just wanted to give you an overview and then also kind of explain to you what my experiences have been with some of these things. So I hope it, if anything at all, it was a little helpful.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I think it was a lot of great information. I just want everybody to know that there will be, after this session, I will be sending out a survey, a copy of the presentation, and a recording of the presentation. Please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions for Dr. Trevino, or we'd like to learn more about the Office of Research Support's upcoming programs. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.